You know what finally made me angry enough to change how I buy wood? I'd driven 45 minutes to a lumber yard, hand-picked what I thought were beautiful white oak boards, paid a premium for them, brought them home, and within a week half of them had twisted so badly I couldn't flatten them without losing a quarter inch of thickness. And I'm not talking about cheap box store lumber. This was a real hardwood dealer. I kept thinking I was doing something wrong in my shop. Maybe my storage was off. Maybe I was acclimating them wrong. Then I came across a set of old guild training texts from the 1600s, written for apprentice carpenters in southern Germany, and I realized something that stopped me cold. Those old craftsmen never would have selected those trees in the first place. They could read a living tree the way you and I read a tape measure. They knew what was inside the wood before they ever made a cut, and the signs were right there on the outside the whole time. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what they looked for, step by step, how bark, branches, location, trunk shape, and even the sound a tree makes can tell you whether the wood inside is dense, straight-grained, and worth your time, or twisted, weak, and destined for the firewood pile. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a marking technique these guild carpenters used on every single tree they felled. And it solves a grain orientation problem most of us don't even know we have. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about today is a lost system of timber selection, a set of skills that were once considered so essential to the craft that you literally could not advance from apprentice to journeyman without demonstrating them. And the beautiful thing is, every principle I'm going to share with you is based on observable, repeatable signs that nature puts right in front of us. Once you learn to see them, you can't unsee them. So let me start with where this knowledge comes from and why it deserves your trust. The European carpenter guilds operated from roughly the 1200s through the 1800s, and they were serious institutions. In the Germanic tradition especially, an apprentice would spend anywhere from 3 to 7 years under a master before he was even allowed to select timber independently. A big part of that training wasn't about joints or tools. It was about standing in a forest and learning to read trees. These weren't mystics. They were practical tradesmen building structures that had to last, and they couldn't afford to drag a 500-pound oak log out of the woods, only to find out the wood inside was punky or full of reaction grain. So they developed a system. They taught apprentices to evaluate bark texture, branch pattern, trunk taper, crown shape, soil conditions, slope, exposure, and a dozen other indicators, all before making a single saw cut. I first encountered the depth of this knowledge through an English green woodworker named Peter, who still practices traditional timber selection in the Chiltern Hills. Watching him walk through a stand of trees and reject 9 out of 10 before settling on the one he wanted was like watching someone speak a language I didn't know existed. Every choice he made, he could explain. And when I started applying his lessons to my own wood buying, the difference in the quality of my projects was immediate and dramatic. These aren't theories. These are field-tested methods refined over 6 centuries of daily practice. Let me show you what they saw. The first thing the guild carpenters evaluated was the bark itself. And this is where most of us have never even thought to look. Bark isn't just a shell. It's a record of what's happening inside the tree. Here's the principle. Tight, uniform, finely textured bark almost always indicates slow, even growth, which means dense, straight-grained wood. Bark that's deeply furrowed, cracked in irregular patterns, or peeling in random patches is telling you the tree has been under stress, growing unevenly, and the wood inside will reflect that. Take white oak as an example. A mature white oak with bark that runs in tight, even vertical ridges, with shallow furrows spaced roughly a quarter inch to a half inch apart, is almost certainly going to give you dense, workable lumber. But a white oak of the same diameter whose bark is broken into blocky, irregular plates with deep, random cracks has been fighting for light, dealing with drought cycles, or growing on poor soil. The wood inside will be uneven in density, more prone to warping, and harder to work with hand tools because the grain won't be consistent. I tested this myself on a fallen ash tree a couple of years ago. One side had smooth, tight bark with fine diamond-shaped ridges. The other side, which had been facing a clearing and getting hammered by wind, had rough, flaky bark with wide, irregular cracks. When I split that log, the tight bark side gave me straight-grained billets that split clean as glass. The rough bark side was full of interlocked grain that fought me the entire way. Same tree, same diameter, completely different wood quality, and the bark told me everything I needed to know before I ever swung the froe. What the guild text specifically warned about was spiral bark. If you see bark ridges that twist around the trunk rather than running straight up, The grain inside is spiraling too, and that lumber will twist on you no matter how carefully you dry it. That's exactly the kind of board I was bringing home from the lumber yard and blaming my shop conditions for. The tree was telling anyone who looked that the wood would twist. Nobody at the mill bothered to check. The second thing these craftsmen read was the branching pattern, and this one surprised me more than anything else. The rule is simple but powerful. A tree with a long, clean trunk and branches concentrated near the top will produce straighter, clearer lumber than a tree with branches starting low and scattered all the way up. The reason is biology. Every branch creates a knot inside the trunk and not just at the surface. That knot extends inward to the pith, disrupting grain flow for the entire radius at that height. But beyond knots, low branching signals something about the tree's life. A tree that branches low has been growing in the open with plenty of light on all sides. That sounds good, but it actually means fast, uneven growth. The side facing south grows faster than the north side. You get wide growth rings that vary in width around the circumference. And that variation is what causes boards to cup and twist. A tree that grew in a dense stand, competing for light, puts all its energy into growing straight up toward the canopy. The branches self-prune as the lower ones get shaded out. The trunk is long and clean, and the growth rings are tight and uniform all the way around. That is the tree the guild carpenter wanted. Peter showed me how to evaluate this in about 10 seconds. You stand back from the tree, look at where the first living branch starts, and compare that height to the total height of the tree. If the clear trunk makes up at least 2/3 of the total height, that is a competition-grown tree with good prospects. If branches start at 1/3 or less of the total height, it is an open-grown tree that will give you character wood at best and frustration at worst. I started paying attention to this at lumber yards too, looking at the end grain of boards. Wide, uneven ring spacing almost always comes from open-grown trees with low branching. Tight, uniform rings come from stand-grown timber. The guild carpenters were selecting for this in the forest. Modern mills are just cutting whatever shows up on the truck. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now that you understand how they read bark and branches, the next thing I noticed was how much attention these craftsmen paid to where the tree was standing. Not just the forest in general, but the exact spot, the slope, the soil, the exposure. The guild texts are very specific about this. A tree growing on a moderate north-facing slope in deep, well-drained soil was considered ideal. North-facing because the growth is slower and more uniform, without direct southern sun blasting one side. Moderate slope because water drains instead of pooling, which prevents rot in the lower trunk. Deep soil because the tree doesn't have to fight for nutrients and can grow steadily for decades. What they avoided was just as telling. Trees at the edge of a clearing were rejected because of uneven sun exposure. Trees on ridge tops were rejected because constant wind creates reaction wood, a type of abnormally dense stressed wood that warps and splits unpredictably. Trees in low, wet areas were rejected because waterlogged roots produce fast, spongy growth. A sugar maple growing on a north-facing hillside with 6 inches of good topsoil over clay will produce wood that's 30 to 40% denser than the same species growing in a wet bottomland. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between a tabletop that stays flat for 50 years and one that moves on you every season. I tested this with 2 cherry logs I sourced from different sites. One came from a hillside stand, the other from a flat, moist field edge. The hillside cherry was noticeably heavier, harder under the plane, and when I finished it with just oil, the grain popped with a depth the other board couldn't match. Same species, same diameter, same age by the ring count. Totally different wood because of where they grew. The fourth method is one you can evaluate from 50 feet away, and it's the shape of the trunk itself. Guild carpenters looked for what they called a gradual taper, a trunk that narrows slowly and evenly from base to crown. A tree that maintains a fairly consistent diameter for a long run, and then tapers gently near the top has been growing in balance. The wood inside will have uniform density from bottom to top. What they rejected was a tree with heavy butt swell, where the base flares out dramatically, or a tree that tapers rapidly, going from thick to thin in a short span. Butt swell often indicates the tree is compensating for root instability or wet soil. The wood in that swollen base is full of irregular grain and tension. Rapid taper indicates the tree has been putting most of its energy into the lower trunk and not growing efficiently. Both produce lumber that's unpredictable on the bench. The ideal trunk, according to the old texts, should lose no more than about 1 inch of diameter for every 8 feet of height. So a tree that's 18 inches in diameter at chest height should still be around 16 inches at the first major branch, roughly 16 feet up. If it drops to 12 inches in that same span, that's too much taper, and the grain will not be consistent. The fifth thing they read was the crown, the overall shape and density of the leaf canopy. A full symmetrical crown with evenly distributed branches indicates a healthy tree with balanced growth. A lopsided crown, or one with large dead sections, tells you the tree has been stressed, lost a major limb at some point, or is declining. The wood in a stressed tree contains what woodworkers call reaction wood. In hardwoods, this is tension wood on the upper side of a lean, and it's nasty to work with. In softwoods, reaction wood forms as compression wood on the underside of a lean, and it's brittle and dense in all the wrong ways. A perfectly vertical tree with an even crown rarely has significant reaction wood. Now here's a method Peter taught me that isn't in any of the guild texts I've found, but he swears it was passed down to him orally. He calls it the knock test. You take a heavy wooden mallet or even just a dense stick, and you strike the trunk firmly about chest height. Then you listen. A healthy, dense tree resonates. You get a clear, sustained tone, almost like tapping a drum. A tree with internal rot, hollow pockets, or spalting gives you a dull thud with no sustain. I was skeptical, but I tried it on a standing beech that looked perfect from the outside. Beautiful bark, straight trunk, good crown. It thudded. When the tree eventually came down in a storm, the lower 8 feet were completely punky inside. That knock test would have saved whoever felled it a lot of wasted effort. Let me share some patterns I've noticed that most of us fall into. Things I did myself for years that these guild methods handle completely differently. The first pattern is buying lumber based on appearance alone. We go to the yard, we flip through the stack, and we pick the boards that look the prettiest. Clear faces, nice color, no visible knots. But we almost never check the end grain to see how that tree actually grew. The guild carpenters would have laughed at that. They knew a beautiful face can hide terrible grain structure. They always started with growth ring evaluation, not surface appearance. The second pattern is trusting the grade stamp. When a board is marked as select or number 1 common, we assume that means it will behave well in our projects. But lumber grading is based primarily on the percentage of clear cuttings you can get from a board. It tells you nothing about density, ring spacing, growth conditions, or how stable that board will be over time. A select grade board from a fast-grown open field tree will move more than a number 2 common board from a slow-grown hillside tree. The grade stamp is about yield, not quality. The third pattern is ignoring weight. The guild carpenters would heft a piece of timber before they'd even look at the grain. Heavier means denser, period. 2 boards of the same species and the same dimensions should weigh roughly the same. If one is noticeably lighter, that's fast growth, wide rings, and less structural integrity. I started weighing boards at the lumber yard with the bathroom scale I keep in my truck, and the variation within a single species is shocking. I've seen white oak boards vary by 30% in weight within the same stack. The fourth pattern is assuming kiln dried means stable. Kiln drying reduces moisture content, but it does nothing about reaction wood, spiral grain, or uneven density. A poorly grown tree will still produce a poorly behaved board after kiln drying. It'll just be dry while it twists on you. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you start making very different choices, and your projects start behaving the way you expect them to. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes directly from the guild tradition, and I've never seen it mentioned in any modern woodworking book. When a guild carpenter selected a tree and was ready to fell it, the first thing he did before the axe touched the trunk was mark the north face with a scribe line or a chalk mark. He then transferred that orientation mark to every log section as the tree was bucked up. The reason is that the north face of a tree, at least in the northern hemisphere, has the tightest, most uniform growth rings because it gets the least direct sun. When it came time to lay out joinery, the guild craftsman would orient the north face toward the show side of the piece or toward the bearing surface of a joint. The densest, most stable wood went where it mattered most. I started doing this with logs I sourced directly, and the difference is real. The north face planes cleaner, takes finish more evenly, and holds a scribed line more crisply. It takes 5 seconds to mark a tree before you fell it, and it gives you information you can use through the entire life of that project. One chalk mark, and you carry the forest's wisdom all the way to the finished piece. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.